being recorded. If you're tweeting, please use the hashtag @CHEvents and #CHEvents and @Chatham House. For online attendees, please put questions throughout the event using the Q&A box on your screen. And for those attending in person, remember that we're going to have a drinks reception after the event, so please stay. That's an incentive to stay for the whole meeting. We have this evening both international lawyers and non-lawyers. The topic is obvious of interest to both, and we'll try to bridge any divide that there may be between us. As you know, people in too many countries are suffering from armed conflict at the moment, whether it be non-international conflict, as in Sudan, or international, as in Ukraine. Now, different bodies of international law apply to these conflicts. We have the law prohibiting or regulating the resort to force, primarily contained in the Charter of the United Nations and too often violated. We also have international humanitarian law, or the law of armed conflict, aiming to protect civilians and regulating the way in which hostilities are carried out. And there are other bodies of law, such as international human rights law, which may be applicable. But in applying the law, we need to know whether or not a state or a group is a party to the armed conflict. In many cases, this is obviously very clear. In the case of the international armed conflict following Russia's invasion, we clearly have Ukraine and Russia as parties to that international armed conflict. In other cases, we have to give more consideration to the matter. What degree of assistance to belligerents can cause the assisting state to become a party to the conflict? Of course, the law is only one of the important aspects. Politically, it matters a great deal to a country whether it is regarded as a party to a conflict or not. And there may be huge repercussions, leaving aside what the law says. So this meeting concludes a project which was funded by the British Red Cross. We are grateful, as always, to our collaboration with the British Red Cross and to Michael Meyer, KC, in particular. The project looked at what international law has to say about party status, who are parties, and what are the consequences. Are there any recommendations to governments? And a paper has been published with the results of the research. The primary writer is Alex Bentker, who is just in the front here. He's a researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law. And OUP will shortly be publishing his book, Party Status, in July. So, speakers. Paul Berman, he's a legal director in the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and other positions he's held in the past include a period in the legal division of the ICRC in Geneva and as a director in the European Union Council Legal Service. Stephen Hill on the screen in Malta. He was the chief legal advisor to the Secretary General of NATO between 2014 and 2020. He's currently Executive Secretary of the International Institute for Justice and the Rule of Law. Professor Marko Milanovic, Professor of Public International Law at the University of Reading, formerly Professor at Nottingham University, and very well known to many of us as the author of manifold insightful blogs on the blog EJIL Talk. Thank you for those, Marco. So what we're going to do, we're going to start with Paul giving us an overview of the subject, and then we'll enter into discussion with Marco and Stephen, and perhaps picking up questions as we go, if I can read well enough online. So I want to start by Paul. Please, an overview. Thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. It's a pleasure to be here, and many thanks to Chatham House for organising this event on what we're going to see is a very topical as well as a very important issue. And can I also join your thanks to the British Red Cross for commissioning this project as well. And also to join the thanks and congratulations to the International Law Programme for your really excellent research paper on joining in wars. It combines legal scholarship with clarity, as well as an understanding of the wider political context. And my congratulations to Dr. Alexander Venka. Your talents, your real command of the subject matter, your ability to synthesize difficult issues is well reflected in the paper. And if I may, Elizabeth, thank you for your excellent chairing of the roundtables last year, which was a key part of that project as well. Now, as you mentioned, this is a part of it is a legal topic, so there is a lot of technicality at the heart of this. We're dealing with what are the legal rules for determining when a state or another actor becomes a party to an armed conflict alongside others and is therefore bound by international humanitarian law, IHL, or what's sometimes known as the law of armed conflict. And particularly, what are the rules when a state or another actor joins an existing conflict? We may come on to more, perhaps in the discussion, more on the legal detail. But what I want to do first, to kind of set the scene, is to look briefly at why the subject is so topical and why it's so politically important, and also what are, for me, some of the key lessons that I take from the work that's been done in the project. Now, I'm doing so from the perspective, as you've heard, of a government lawyer, and therefore, inevitably, there's going to be a legal slant to what I say. I have to underline, I'm speaking here in a strictly personal capacity, not an official capacity, so there will be things I can't comment on. And I should also have to add, for form's sake, that excellent as the paper is, the UK government does not necessarily endorse all its conclusions, and that's the formal bit out of the way. So let's turn to the topic. It can be tempting to think that all of the fundamental issues around applying IHL should have been settled long ago. After all, it can claim to be one of the longest established parts of international law. It's one of the most widely ratified parts of international law, and its aims to limit the means and methods of warfare, to protect those not taking part in fighting, are well understood and clear. And I think, if I may touch on your point, Elizabeth, as well, it's important to recall that the perennial major issue with IHL today remains respect for its rules and its implementation. I think we need to bear that in mind all the time. But it's striking, nevertheless, how often fundamental issues about the application of IHL can recur and raise real practical issues. And that can mean us, as in this project, going back to first principles and revisiting some old legal concepts. Now, this is sometimes needed because of changes in the nature of armed conflict or changes in the nature of the actors taking part in armed conflict. But it can also reflect, and that's the case here, advances in military technology and the increasingly complex patterns of international cooperation. Now, to be clear, this is not all new. States have long sought to assist others engaged in armed conflict through, for example, providing training, equipment, and advice. And the consequences of doing so have been the subject of much political, legal analysis, and indeed international litigation. And for the lawyers here, we'll all be familiar with the Nicaragua ICJ case in 1986. But in an increasingly technologically sophisticated and interdependent world, there is now an unprecedented range of means of providing assistance. This includes through political, financial, and humanitarian support, supply of military equipment, training, provision of intelligence, satellite imagery, cyber operations, and so on, all of which can be provided with more or less intensity. It's essential, therefore, to be clear as to when this support can cross the line into actually participating in an armed conflict. Also, it's important to be clear that legal issues around states joining in conflicts alongside others are not new either. The old term co-belligerency has long been used to describe states waging war together against a common enemy. And states have long been alert to the importance of not crossing legal thresholds. If we go back to 1941, prior to its own entry into the Second World War, the US was vigilant that its military assistance under Lend-Lease didn't make it a co-belligerent. But the term co-belligerent has close associations with the law of neutrality and pre-UN Charter concepts, the old binary world in which a state was either a neutral or a belligerent. The Chatham House paper, rightly in my view, therefore has abandoned the term co-belligerent in favour of co-party. The extent to which the law of neutrality still applies is a matter of debate, but it's notable, for example, how little states have referred to neutrality in relation to support for Ukraine. It's become clear that the law of neutrality, whatever its content, has no relevance to determining co-party status, hence the need for us now to re-examine this issue through the prism of modern international law. The issues around the support provided to Ukraine and to Russia have more generally provided a very real backdrop to the discussion of this topic in the roundtables held here last year and in the paper. In the 2 years since Russia's aggression against Ukraine, NATO allies and other states have been clear that the supply of equipment to Ukraine does not make them a party to the conflict, an analysis confirmed by the paper. But as last week's reactions to the idea of a deployment of Western personnel in non-combat roles but on the ground, and other recent press stories indicate, the nature and level of support remains, understandably, a highly sensitive issue. Deciding whether an actor has become a party to an armed conflict is, as I've said, a matter of legal and factual assessment, but it can't be simply pigeonholed as a technical issue. It has huge political and military importance. There is, of course, significant political impact, domestic and international, in determining that one is joining in a war. States may no longer formally declare war with the associated gravity and drama, but the magnitude of determining that one has crossed the threshold into armed conflict and the seriousness with which it's addressed by ministers, parliamentarians and officials is no less important. And it's important to recall that the legal consequences themselves are significant. It means that a state's own forces can be lawfully attacked under IHL, carrying with it further implications for expanding the scope of the conflict and further escalation. Moreover, the scope for misunderstanding and miscalculation and escalation by an adverse party is also very real. A state's own analysis, however clear and rigorous, may have limited value if the other party reads or presents the situation differently and responds accordingly. By seeking to establish clear thresholds and criteria, the Chatham House project makes a really valuable contribution to managing those risks. What then are some of the practical lessons I'd identify to draw from this project in addressing these issues? First of all, the research paper gives us two criteria to determine co-party status: cooperation with other co-parties and direct connection to hostilities, that is, causing harm to the enemy, and that is the heart of the analysis. To be clear, we're not concerned here with self-evident cases where a state's armed forces are themselves conducting combat operations, nor at the other end of the spectrum with political, financial, humanitarian assistance or the general supply of military materiel, which do not entail co-party status. It's rather the range of logistical, intelligence, advisory, cyber and other support, including use of territory and airspace, which may or may not be sufficient to make an actor a co-party to the conflict. In practice, this needs to be assessed case by case. No two situations are identical, but that's true of many areas of international law and IHL in particular. And the paper provides useful guidance to inform what is direct connection to hostilities. It talks about geographical and temporal proximity to the harm to the adversary and the nature and scale of the activities. Overall, the authors of the paper have provided as much clarity, guidance and explanation as possible and produced a test which is informed by and very close to actual state practice. Secondly, it's important to be clear that in practice, the law is not neatly compartmentalized. Different legal regimes can apply in parallel, and that's also politically significant. In particular, the relationship between IHL and the actual lawfulness of the use of force that Elizabeth mentioned, the jus ad bellum, is one which preoccupies specialists. And it's therefore not surprising it can equally cause confusion for political leaders, the media, and the wider public. It's very important to be clear that the issue of becoming a party to an armed conflict is about applying IHL. It says nothing about whether the underlying use of force is lawful. These are two different things. A state can accept that it is in an armed conflict with both sides obliged to comply with IHL and still take the view that its adversary's use of force is in violation of the UN Charter and thus unlawful. Equally, even if a state is not a co-party, and that is a far more common scenario, that's not the end of the story. Its action in support of a party to an armed conflict can still entail its obligations under the law of state responsibility, that is not to aid or assist an internationally wrongful act, and specific treaties. This is not, I know, the focus of this discussion, but there are matters to which the UK government and other like-minded governments attach great importance. And finally, and this is my last point, Elizabeth, perhaps my key takeaway from the project is it's important to think carefully about the specific nature of being a co-party, particularly as compared to being a party in a bilateral conflict. As the research paper notes, being a co-party can entail obligations in relation to the conduct of other co-parties, although the extent of that's a matter for debate. But even more important from a political and a practical perspective, the threshold for joining in a war, for becoming a co-party to an existing armed conflict, can be lower than the usual legal thresholds for establishing the existence of a new conflict, which are recourse to armed force between states for an international conflict and meeting the threshold of intensity of hostilities for a non-international armed conflict. To take one example mentioned in the paper, Kuwait and Qatar were regarded as co-parties to the war against Iraq in 2003 for, amongst other things, allowing their territory to be used, even though they had not themselves actually resorted to armed force. In brief, a state can more readily find itself a party to an armed conflict when joining an existing conflict, even without its own forces firing a single shot. It underlines the need for clarity, of vigilance and rigour in determining when that threshold is crossed, and it's a real reminder of the importance and the current relevance of this topic.
Thank you so much, Paul. And that brings us nicely on to look at specifics. You've mentioned the example which all of us have in mind about Ukraine and Russia, and you've said that NATO states have made clear that in their view, their assistance to Ukraine does not make them parties to the conflict. Marco, do you want to explore that example anymore? Do you have any other examples that we ought to be having in mind as we discuss?
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Thank you also for having me, and thank you to Chatham House for this opportunity, and thank you all for coming. I think there's actually many examples where this co-party issue arises, and in fact, over the past 20 years, the big context in which it was discussed was more non-international armed conflict scenarios. I don't know, the US and the Northern Alliance fighting the Taliban in December 2001. The US, regarding Al-Qaeda as being in some kind of global non-international armed conflict with the United States for decades, and then having associated forces like Al-Shabaab being co-belligerents in that. So that's the kind of context in which all of this has been discussed. The ICRC also devoted some attention to this issue and produced a study arguing for this support-based approach, but they really focused on non-international armed conflict. Today, however, our obsession is international armed conflict, and especially Ukraine, Russia, where you have so many states supporting Ukraine, but you also have states like Iran and North Korea supporting Russia. So on Ukraine, just to illustrate the importance of this, on Ukraine, Russia, let me just give you some tidbits over the past week from news reporting. Okay, and so you can see what leaders are saying and what lines they are drawing. So the first example, the German Chancellor Scholz saying he will not export the Taurus missile system to Ukraine. And how does he rationalize it? He says, we don't want to be like the Brits and the French. Because if we send them Taurus, we need to send German troops there to operate the system, like he said the Brits at least have done. Yeah? So suddenly everybody here goes a bit crazy, and says, is it really true that there's British soldiers in Ukraine operating the Storm Shadow long-range missile system? Then you have the lovely spy drama from Singapore, where the head of the German Luftwaffe, I love it, by the way, the fact you still call it the Luftwaffe, caught on tape while being not exactly cautious while logging into a WebEx meeting, discussing these same issues. And he actually said the French are not there, the Brits are there, and they have people on the ground. President Macron, so the example Paul implicitly mentioned, saying we need to go full in. We need to send troops into Ukraine. That cannot be excluded. So everybody then sort of thinks, well, he's grandstanding a bit as he's normally keen to do. But then there's some reporting from Politico that in a much more confidential setting, the French chief of staff wrote to half of NATO allies, I wonder why he didn't write to the other half, and said we need to consider doing the following things. Operating defensive systems, launching cyber operations. So not helping Ukraine defend itself from cyber operations, but launching cyber operations, helping with demining. So those kinds of examples. So do those cross the threshold of being a co-party to the armed conflict? And then finally, 2 weeks ago, there was a really extensive article in the New York Times about the level of CIA support to Ukraine and specifically to Ukraine military intelligence. And it's well worth a read, about this relationship, how it has developed, evolved over time, how it was different from 2014 to 2022, and then scaled up after the full-scale invasion. But there's some really lovely quotes there. So for example, one senior US official is quoted as saying about the CIA's presence in Ukraine, are they pulling triggers? No. Are they helping with targeting? Absolutely. And then there's a quote about a very specific incident where Russian forces are trying to cross a bridge. The Brits and the Americans use real-time satellite imagery to confirm to Ukraine that this is what's going on, and Ukraine launches an attack. So these are sort of the kinds of issues that inform our discussion today.
Thank you so much, Marco. So we're leaving all of that hanging in the air as we go on with our discussion. I have to say, those New York Times articles, they did make me wonder, why on earth did they get all of that stuff from intelligence guys, who are the most close-lipped people?
People love to talk to the New York Times, I suppose.
Well, or they don't, but anyway, leaving that there. I want to turn to you, Steve, if I may. With all of that in our heads, and turn to international organizations. What does it mean when we say that an international organization can be a party to an armed conflict? And what are the implications for organizations like the United Nations and NATO? And I just want to throw in as well to you, when you were working for NATO, in your experience at NATO, what was the impact of this question of co-party status? When did you leave? You left before Ukraine. Sorry, I've forgotten, but you'll tell me. 2020, I see, okay, but still, there had been another Crimean invasion. Can I put those to you, please, Steve?
Sure. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and greetings from the Maltese archipelago. I really wish I could have been there with you all this evening, but it's great to be online, and thanks to everyone who's attending. I want to add my congratulations to the other panelists, both to Chatham House and also to the British Red Cross for putting together this very useful report. So I was the chief legal advisor to NATO's Secretary General from 2014. In fact, I started right with the invasion of Crimea up until the end of February 2020, when the pandemic was just happening. And then I had the chance to work on the U.S. National Security Council for about a year and a half before I came to Malta. So I should just clarify that even though I'm not a government employee anymore, as some of this stuff might relate to things that happened when I was a government employee, I'm really speaking in that regard in my personal capacity. So, so what does it mean? Why does this issue of co-party status come up a lot in NATO? Well, it's because, first of all, NATO operates by consensus. So there are 31 allies. There will soon be, with the imminent addition of Sweden as a NATO ally, 32 allies. And NATO's decision-making rule is always one of consensus. And so it's important to forge in all NATO matters a common understanding, at least at a certain level, of what's going on. And so that's why I commend efforts like this that try to help clarify legal frameworks. Maybe you asked about the United Nations. I worked at my country's mission to the United Nations for several years. Maybe I'll give an example from the United Nations to see why what it means for an international organization to be a party to an armed conflict. In the case of the UN, there was a very robust peace mission in the Congo, MONUSCO, which had a so-called intervention force that was able to take on much more significant kind of military tasks and kinetic capabilities than your run-of-the-mill UN mission. And so in that context, and given the way that the UN is organized, where the UN is really in charge of peacekeeping forces, even though contingents are provided by different UN member states, there was really a concern that the UN, the United Nations organization itself, could be considered a party to the conflict. And that would have serious implications for the organization. For example, the traditional immunity that's afforded to UN personnel, including parts of this MONUSCO force, might not apply in that case, right? And in fact, the report cites a very important speech that was made by the then UN Legal Counsel to the International Law Commission, talking about this very issue. So there were real practical implications for the UN's, its own immunity under relevant conventions. NATO works a little bit differently. I was talking about how UN missions are very much under the command and control of the United Nations, despite being composed of different contingents. In NATO, it's sort of the other way around, at least the way we look at NATO from a legal perspective. In NATO, the legal construct is much more that it's each contributing nation, each ally, that is really the one that's responsible for carrying out and complying with its own legal obligations. And that NATO, the alliance itself, is more of has a different role. And so it's less likely, just because of the legal construction, and a lot of people, I think, don't appreciate this, that NATO could become a party to a conflict. NATO itself, for example, in the Ukraine situation, is certainly not providing kind of materiel to or any sort of military equipment to Ukraine. This is the individual allies that are doing it. So in the NATO context, it's important to look at the exact nature of the operations. But it is an important issue in NATO. You asked me, in my experience, what has been the impact of the question on the alliance's work? Well, it's an extremely important issue because, as Paul and also Marco and yourself, Elizabeth, alluded to, party to the conflict is kind of a vocabulary, I think, that says a lot of things and might mean different things to different people. And so, as Marco was saying, the main context in which these questions presented themselves up until really the Russia's aggression against Ukraine was much more in relation to non-state actors. It was with regard to Al-Qaeda, talking about Afghanistan, et cetera. And within NATO, there was certainly close attention by a number of allies to ensuring that somehow either they themselves, individually or as a group, or certainly the alliance itself, wouldn't somehow trip the wire, as it were, and come into some kind of co-party status. I'm thinking in this regard, for example, of NATO's Resolute Support mission, which it was in Afghanistan as a train, advise, and assist mission, and that's the kind of some of the activities that Paul mentioned in his catalog. I'm also thinking about NATO's training mission in Iraq, the NATO mission in Iraq. These were contexts where there was definitely attention paid to the notion that individual allies and the alliance itself, of course, were not interested in becoming parties to the conflict. Can I just say also that I think in the context of Ukraine, despite the fact that there's a lot of debate swirling around this question, I actually see this issue as a source of unity, because the messaging from the alliance, Paul cited the German chancellor, but also you can look at the Secretary General himself in his various comments, are always very clear that NATO is not a party to the conflict in Ukraine. And of course, this is supported by the analysis in the paper. I see that as actually, as opposed to being a source of problems and difficulties and debates, it's actually an area where allies can come together. And given the importance of consensus within the 31 and soon to be 32 member alliance, I think that's an important thing. So back over to you, Elizabeth. Those are sort of my initial reflections.
Thank you very much indeed. You said that this phrase, party to a conflict, carried a lot of content. Do you think, and I'll turn to Marco first, do you think there's a difference between what lawyers think of as party to a conflict and what properly advised governments do, and the public perception of what is a party to a conflict?
There's definitely a difference. I mean, people really need to be clear on this, that a legal analysis of whether, I don't know, the UK or the United States is a party to the international armed conflict between Ukraine and Russia is related to, but is substantially different from, a policy analysis of whether the official position of, say, this government should be that we are or are not in a state of armed conflict with Russia. Those are very, very, really different considerations. You know, as lawyers, we would try to apply some questions of principle that are contextual, but that can be applied similarly to reasonably similar situations in a very consistent way. Politicians do different things. So a policymaker really has two basic concerns. A policymaker sells a particular narrative to their own domestic constituency, and most countries, in Europe don't want to be in a war in Russia, and that is the story a politician in Europe will tell their domestic constituency, and they're also signaling to Russia that they don't want to escalate. That's the key point. Certainly, we don't want to escalate to World War III, which is the language President Biden used, right? On the other hand, the law doesn't really factor that much necessarily into that analysis. Sometimes the leaders use very legalistic language, so you could see that from Chancellor Scholz. But if you're analyzing Russia's position on this, I'm pretty sure they couldn't care less about whether, as a legal matter, the UK and Russia are in a state of armed conflict. So they will push the escalation narrative if it suits them, not because the law says X on this issue. So bottom line, it is perfectly possible for politicians to sell a narrative, we are not at war with Russia, while legally, actually we might be, right? So that's, a perfectly plausible, in fact, with some of these examples, maybe the right answer.
Thank you. Steve, do you want to add anything to that, or Paul?
Just to say that I think it's the public has a right to know whether their country is at war with other countries. It's just that, as with many things, as Marco perfectly points out, there's a kind of disjuncture between what the legal terminology means in a technical sense and the way it's used in I wouldn't even say in political discussions, but oftentimes the international law terminology becomes a stand-in for broader concepts just because it's a term and it's out there and it's something that we discuss. And so I think it's perfectly understandable that this happens. I think it's just important, as the other panelists have said, that we pay attention to the different ways in which this term is being used. Thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, if I may, I agree that there is this kind of disconnect, but I think it's very, very difficult in practice to separate the two. I think that sometimes there's a danger as lawyers will go in and tell ministers, well, this might make you a party to an armed conflict, and it's only a technical thing. It doesn't, you're just crossing the threshold, and it just changes which law applies. But that's where the common sense, frankly, if I may, of ministers kicks in, and they say, what, you're saying we're a party in armed conflict, you mean we're at war? Well, that is the implication. I think sometimes, as lawyers, we need to be careful that we don't lose sight of the wider resonance and the impact that has as well. I think, if I may pick up your point as well, I think Steve made the point as well, one of the things that comes out of all this stuff from the press is just how seriously political leaders take these thresholds, because they understand the resonance that attaches to them, and they are approaching them with rigor.
Marco, here are we lawyers, and particularly Alex. He's written this paper. He's written a book on becoming a party. Are we just tying ourselves into knots as lawyers? And because of the difference in perception and the political repercussions and the political importance, what's the real point of doing all this as lawyers? Is there really a great difference? Why can't we just say, I want to be at war with Russia, or I don't want to be at war with Russia, and lawyers run away?
I think we as lawyers need to be aware of our own limitations, right? And certainly in countries like the UK, where legal advice is routinely heeded, you can say an international lawyer is more important than in a country like Russia. I have no idea whether the legal advisor of the Russian Foreign Ministry sends memo that Mr. Putin reads. I doubt it, But I do think, though, that as lawyers engaged in this enterprise, we need to provide answers to objectively difficult questions. This particular question is objectively difficult because there's nothing in the text of the treaties that answers it. Now, that means there's a lot of reasonable interpretative room. And so Alex can write whatever sort of Alex wants, and it can make sense in some way. Yeah, so there's a lot of wiggle room in sort of the factors one can identify. What we need, though, are objective factors. So we can't just say, well, if the state officially says it's war, it's at war, it's at war. If it denies it, it's not. Because that's the regime we had 100 years ago. And the regime we had 100 years ago meant that states were at war but denied it. And millions, literally millions died, like the Japanese-Chinese war. And nobody applied the law of war. So we need objective criteria. Now, the objective criteria that the paper quite sensibly proposes, there's two of them, are that on the one hand, there's a reasonably direct contribution by a supporting state to the conflict, that there's a direct connection of some kind to hostilities. And the other, that there's a degree of coordination, cooperation between the various parties. Those make sense to my mind. They are sort of what you would look at. Both the advantage and disadvantage of these criteria is that they're not going to produce some mathematically clear results. So in so many other different areas of the law, we will have easy cases. We will have hard cases. Why does it matter? As a matter of law, the main reason why it matters is the one that Paul mentioned. If IHL applies, if, I don't know, a British soldier is in Ukraine, and by the way, the UK did confirm last week that a small number of British troops are deployed in Ukraine. If they are, in fact, participating in the armed conflict, that means that Russia can, as a matter of IHL, target them, even though that targeting, again, as quite correctly said by Paul, would still be an act of aggression under the UN Charter. So that's why it matters. I hope I made sense.
Yeah, thanks very much. Let's then get on to the criteria, because that's at the heart of, as Paul said, the criteria for being a co-party. So we have, first, a direct connection to hostilities, and secondly, cooperation or coordination with at least one of the other parties. Otherwise, you're all fighting separate wars. You've got to have some kind of cooperation or coordination. I want Steve and Marco to give us some examples, not the very easy ones, but the difficult ones. And while you're doing that, I want you also to answer one of the questions online from Carolyn Buff. And she asks, why wouldn't the provision of military materiel result in a party becoming a state becoming a co-party to a conflict if, quote, but for, unquote, the provision of that materiel, the outcome of the conflict would be radically different? So as you think of the examples in considering, well, is this amount of assistance make you a co-party? Does that amount? Can you also consider that question, which is the but-for question? Now, who's going to answer first? Steve, I think you look ready for this one.
Okay. Well, okay. So no, I think it's a great question. So, I mean, let's just use that issue. I think it's the general view that the mere provision of military material, as we've heard from the NATO statements and from the statements of different countries, doesn't as such render that the providing state make them a co-party to the conflict. And even if, and the question is about, even if you apply, you were to supply the game-changing, piece of equipment, why wouldn't that make you a co-party? Well, I think that part of this, and we didn't talk so much about the kind of history of this area, the world, before the paper. I mean, I think that the notion that you really do need some kind of act of hostility, some kind of actual, just real physical action is still in the background of the minds of the way that people look at this issue. And I'm not saying that the two criteria that are provided are somehow wrong or don't capture it, but there is this, I think, a strong sense that there needs to be a real, act of war, as it were, a physical act by the assisting state or the supplying state. And I think that probably is what the legal intuition, I would say, that's what comes to mind when I think, well, even if you provided the most incredible weapon that was the biggest game changer, if you yourself didn't somehow actually use it, or actually use force, or if you yourself were not extremely involved in the use of it by the recipient, you're still not a party to the conflict. So that's maybe the I don't know, that's kind of the framework that I still approach this with. And again, it's not to say that the criteria in the paper are off, but I think there really does need to be some tangible, action that goes beyond merely the provision of material. That's my 2 cents on that.
And I think, to be fair to the paper, that it rather supports that the direct connection to the hostilities. But Marco, what do you say?
So I like the fact that Steve used the word intuition. It's a really important word, actually, for what's going on here. So when you read the test, direct connection to hostilities, that sounds like some kind of causal test. Causal test between, or causal relationship between the support given by one state to the other party and the harm on the adversary. So the word direct does the magic here. It's the word direct that distinguishes the aid that makes you a party from the aid that does not make you a party. And we've had, and so the question that was asked online is, isn't it true, though, that if you do a purely causal analysis, the aid we are giving to Ukraine is a but-for cause for a lot of the harm that Ukraine has inflicted on Russia. And you can see that. You can see that when the aid stops, the American aid runs out, Russia advances, right? So you can totally see the but-for relationship. It's not like it's in doubt, yeah? And so we have the same problem in domestic law. So as you know, in tort and criminal law, we often use this idea of proximate cause, which really jumbles together questions of time, questions of normative judgment. So, imagine a scenario, Elizabeth, where you want to murder Paul. Hey, Paul. And I am a gun seller, and I sell you the gun. Yeah. So me selling you the gun was the but-for cause. Like, you could not have killed Paul without me selling you the gun. But we would not normally, in criminal law, hold me as liable for what you did. Yeah. With the gun, because you're an independent moral agent, you are closer to the event, whatever. Yeah? So that's the really tricky issue with the test that is proposed. And as I said, it depends on our intuitions. It means we will have easy cases and hard cases. I do think saying what the easy cases are is important, because we need to know what the easy cases are.
Let's go to the nuts and bolts then. Give us some easy cases.
So the easy cases, so there's easy cases of what does not make you a co-party, and there's easy cases of what does make you a co-party, right? So the first category of easy cases is applying money. Yeah? So we fund Ukraine. Without that funding, the Ukrainian budget and economy would long have collapsed. That is a but-for cause of Ukraine managing to still fight Russia, but the simple fact that we give them money should not be enough. Weapons, so this is the example that has been raised so many times, and not just weapons, munition to use the weapons, training, maybe a bit more difficult, but training how to use the weapons, political moral support, humanitarian assistance. So again, when we provide humanitarian assistance, it means Ukraine can divert some of the resources it would have had to use to, feed its population. It can divert it to the war effort. So those are the easy cases that do not constitute co-party or co-participation. Those that do are, you conduct joint attacks, joint airstrikes, joint special forces. I'm actually pretty sure there's a lot of special forces by several European states in Ukraine, and that they're shooting guns. So the official line will be neither confirm nor deny. I'm pretty sure that's what they're doing. If that is what they're doing, if the SAS people, for example, are there and they're firing their guns, I would think that's a pretty clear case of being a co-party, at least for the short time frame while that is going on. If you launch cyber operations that are tantamount to attacks in the sense of IHL, same thing. If you do joint tactical planning, joint decisions on what is to be struck, I think that's an easy case of being a co-party. So that's easy cases. Hard cases, some types of training, intelligence sharing. If you give them intelligence that is more strategic, Russia will attack you on such and such date, that shouldn't probably make you a co-party. But if you give them the intelligence of the kind, the battleship Moskva is at such and such coordinates, you do whatever you want with this intelligence, and they're going to use it to strike the Moskva and sink it, I think that probably makes you a party. Defensive cyber, so imagine Russia launches cyber operations. We don't just give Ukraine the capability to defend itself, we help them defend themselves. That's, I think, a difficult one. Demining, the one mentioned by the French chief of staff, I suppose it matters which mines you remove. If far from the battlefield, there's a village that's affected by mines, and you remove the mines mainly for humanitarian reasons to help the population not be injured, that's one thing. But if you're trying to help Ukraine remove the mines at the Russian fortification line, I think you're participating in the conflict. Logistical support, if you're fueling their airplanes in air, that has to be, participating in it, or at least I think it is more arguably so. Overflight, I don't know, so there's practice that says simply allowing states to fly over your territory is not enough, but if they give you their airfields, that's probably different. So I think these are the difficult cases. Context matters in them. Reasonable people can, I think, disagree in them.
Context matters. Steve, in your experience, was the contextual answers really the important ones? You have to look at the context. It's difficult to lay down rules here. Is that so?
I think you're absolutely right in that regard. I mean, these are really fact-based analyses, and it's important also to look at I mean, government or international organization like NATO legal advisors have access to generally a larger range of information than might appear in the media. It's very important to look at the actual conduct at hand, and so I agree that the context is extremely important. One case I wanted to add to the list that Marco gave, which was very comprehensive, is the issue of making territory available as the so-called launch pad for attacks. You know, like something that Belarus, for example, has done in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That, to me, that seems like it's one of a perennial case that comes up in different cases. So just to add that to Marco's list. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, when we move from criteria for the moment and come back to consequences of being a party, there's this potential misconception, which is addressed in the paper, that if a state becomes a party to a conflict, it necessarily entitles the adversary under international law to attack that state. So the question is that true, essentially? Can a state open itself up to attack by Russia, for example, by assisting Ukraine in self-defense, by assisting it sufficiently to become a party? And when I ask you that, can you also answer this question, which has come in? Do those NATO members who unilaterally assist a party to a conflict and cross the threshold of becoming a party, and who are then attacked by Russia, are they then entitled to rely on Article 5 of the NATO treaty? That's quite a nice question. As a defence alliance, is it envisaged that members should jointly defend those who unilaterally join a non-member's war? I think that's rather a nice question. So first or second, look at that misconception, if it is a misconception, that you become a party and therefore Russia is legally entitled to attack you.
I think the paper does this really well. I mean, the paper has a bit towards the end, which is like a myth-busting thing. You know, there's some myths, and the paper sort of debunks these myths. One myth, as a legal matter, is that if you become a co-party, somehow you've committed a wrong thing, that you violate international law. No, that's just not true. It depends on whether you're assisting the defender or the aggressor. If you're assisting the aggressor, even without becoming a co-party, you have committed a violation of international law. If you're assisting the defender, there is absolutely no violation of international law, right? So if North Korea provides millions of artillery shells to Russia, we would probably all agree that in so doing, they did not become a party to the armed conflict between Ukraine and Russia. They did, however, commit an internationally wrongful act. They aided and assisted Russian aggression against Ukraine, knowing that that's what Russia was going to use the artillery shells for, right? On the other hand, Ukraine has the right to self-defense. It is both individual and collective. Nothing legally prevents all NATO member states. You don't have to be a member of NATO to respond to a call for a collective self-defense, right? We could all states in the world could gang up on Russia and help Ukraine. The reason why that's not being done, is not because there's a legal barrier to it, but because we don't want World War III over Ukraine. That's why it's not being done. Not because it would be unlawful to do it. To answer the second question, if, I don't know, the UK was now in Ukraine and Russia attacked the UK, it is true, as Paul correctly said, that as a matter of IHL, UK soldiers, if the UK was participating in the conflict, would be lawful targets. It is also true that that would be an act of aggression, now not just against Ukraine, but against the UK. The UK would then have the right to defend itself. The UK would, under NATO, have the right to call upon others to defend the UK. Whether they would do it, they would probably not do it. Again, simply because they don't want to escalate the conflict, not because there's a legal reason not to do it. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the question, Anthony Paviti. I didn't mention your name. Steve, do you want to add to that? Or take away?
No, I mean, I agree with Marco's analysis. There's a difference between the legal rights and obligations and, of course, the overall atmosphere wanting to avoid escalation. But certainly, I would think that people, when they think about this question from a non-lawyer's perspective, might be concerned somehow that having one state become a party to a conflict could overly expose that state. And as Marco says, and as the paper makes very clear, that wouldn't erase the fact that in this particular case it would be a real act of aggression. So I think that's an important take home, hopefully, from this panel. And then I don't have anything to add on the analysis of NATO Article 5. I think Anthony points at one of the real dilemmas at the heart of the alliance. And if you take it just out of the Ukraine context and move it more broadly, I mean, there's always been this balance between the way in which allies look at different aspects of Article 5, and that's why it's actually very important for consultation to happen, and actually for there to be places in which we share information and try to take down the temperature on conflicts and on situations. And that's why in NATO, for example, there's Article 4, which is a kind of political consultation. There's Article 3, which is a constant working together. So there's ways that help to try to take the temperature down. And hopefully contribute to peace in these situations.
Thank you for reminding us that there are articles other than Article 5. Okay, I want to move on to the question of complicity. And we have had a question on this from Dina Mufti, and I'll just read her question first, but then I want to ask a wider question. Her question is, are the UK and US complicit in Israel's illegal occupation of Palestine and the genocide and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from their lands? What are the repercussions? I've read that exactly as the question is put. But I want to bring that into the subject of our discussion, because the comparison between complicity and co-party status is an interesting one. And the question, it has been said already this evening, but I think it bears repeating. The question whether a state becomes complicit in another state's wrongdoing is not the same as whether it becomes a party to an ongoing conflict. But Marco, could you expand a little on the various cases that are being brought in various countries against the governments, Western governments, for supporting Israel? Sometimes the cases are linked to alleged violations of international humanitarian law. After the genocide case, they've sometimes been linked to alleged genocide by Israel. So, recognizing that that's not making these governments parties, I think it's worth just having another word on complicity, if you wouldn't mind.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I would be remiss before answering that question to fail to mention the important work that Chatham House, under your leadership and under Harriet Moynihan's leadership, has done on this issue. So Harriet published this paper on aiding and assisting. Was it 2016? And of course, there's important academic work on this topic, for example, by Miles Jackson, who also contributed to this paper, and so on. So it is one of the conceptually most difficult problems in international law, this issue of complicity. We normally talk about complicity in the international criminal context. This is different. This is when are states complicit in the wrongs of other states or the wrongs of non-state actors. As you said, Elizabeth, there's now these claims before domestic courts with regard to arms exports to Israel. There's actually a new case before the ICJ on this. So I don't know whether you saw that Nicaragua sued Germany for basically, in the ICJ, for basically violating various rules of international law, including Common Article 1 of the Geneva Convention's duty to respect and ensure respect for the conventions by continuing to provide aid to Israel. With all of the aid, let's assume, let's start from that assumption that there's really two different wrongs by Israel that one can think about. One is the continuing occupation of Palestinian territories, which includes all sorts of human rights violations. And the other is Gaza, which raises issues at a minimum of serious risk that there's violations of IHL being committed, right? So the question that was asked online talks really about the first bit about occupation and then talks about Gaza. It is really difficult to apply complicity rules to the continuance of the occupation because I find it difficult to draw a clear causal link in terms of contribution by, say, Western states in Israel maintaining its control over Palestinian territories. It is much easier to make that argument for Gaza because several countries are selling weapons or parts or ammunition to Israel, which Israel is using on a daily basis in Gaza. And I think in doing so, we are in the clear, when it comes to the point of this paper, the clear position that these states are not participating in the armed conflict simply by selling weapons. However, they might be complicit. So I gave you the example of, I don't know, North Korea being complicit in allowing Russia to use the shells it provides to attack Ukraine, Iran giving those loitering munitions, those suicide kamikaze drones to Russia, similar thing. I think you can make at least the same argument here. The question is, what is the standard of fault that applies? Does, for example, the UK need to be certain to the level of actual knowledge that Israel is committing violations of IHL? Or is the relevant standard simply the existence of a risk? Yeah, and there's different views in the literature on this. There are some people also who advocate for purpose-based standards.
Okay, thank you. Because we're not really here to talk about complicity, but Paul.
Yeah, perhaps come back over these points. So can I just come back to an earlier point, Marco, in relation, just to make it clear, the fact the state may have a few troops on the ground does not make it a co-party to a conflict. I think we need to be clear about that. You've got to look at the test in the paper. I just want to be clear on that. On the complicity point, you're absolutely right. This is not about co-party status, but of course it depends on establishing the acts that one may be complicit in. And I think there are certain statements that have been made here today that I wouldn't share. I don't think the UK government would share that those are statements of fact as to what one is being complicit in. But in relation specifically, since it's been mentioned, in relation to the issue of supply of arms, from the point of view of the UK, we obviously have our obligations. Like other states under the Arms Trade Treaty, we have, and I mentioned it before, codified in customary international law, the Article 16 aid and assist obligations as well, which are things that we and others look at very seriously. We also have our own arms export criteria, very similar to those that the EU uses as well. So, I mean, the standards that the UK applies and many of our allies apply as well are quite clearly defined and very, very rigorously assessed as well.
And we covered ourselves in glory by selling weapons to, say, Saudi Arabia.
Okay.
And it's all been litigated in the courts as well. I mean, there's very clear case law on all of this.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. I want to turn to the audience. We've already picked up some questions online, but I want to see if there's anyone with a question in the audience, and I have got another couple online as well. So, and when I call on you, please give your affiliation, even if you're very well known, Mary Ellen. And sorry, wait for the mic, which is coming to you. Thank you.
I'm Mary Ellen O'Connell. I'm from the University of Notre Dame, and I just want to make a brief comment on this topic. For more information, I'm a member of the International Law Association's Committee on the Use of Force, and we are producing our current report on military assistance. And my particular paper will be on some of the additional legal restrictions, even if you've got a right to provide. It's perfectly lawful to be a co-party and provide weapons or short of being a co-party, but there are additional limits under necessity and proportionality about the type of assistance that can be provided. So that's forthcoming. I have a brief question and a disagreement with Marco, just as brief as possible. So you said, you made the quip that Putin doesn't read legal advisors' memos. But Russia was really on rather solid jus ad bellum ground with regard to Kosovo, with regard to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, with regard to Libya, and with regard to providing assistance to Syria. What changed in 2014 that led to the cynical use of the arguments by the West in those conflicts to try to justify the first invasion of Crimea and then the military assistance in the East? Also, I have to disagree with you on intelligence provision, whether that makes you a co-party. Does that really belong in the easy case? I suppose that's my question. We have a traditional view that spies have been part of every armed conflict. We've never treated them as combatants. They are not necessarily involved in kinetic fighting, and I think that's the key. Several of you mentioned, Steve mentioned, the necessity of a kinetic exchange for hostilities to exist, and we have not considered the mere supply of intelligence to be in that. If you're talking about being part of the command and control of actual weapon systems through cyber or through other kinetic means, but not the provision of intelligence.
Thank you very much, Marion. Let's just have, there are at least two major questions there. Let's have another one over here, please. Sorry, yes.
Good afternoon, Riccardo Smimmo, Embassy of Italy. I have a question for Marco. In the light of what you just said about the criteria for being or not being co-party, would you assess with 100% certainty that no country in NATO is co-party in the Ukraine conflict? And if your reply was positive, which countries do you think get closer to trespassing that line? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And we'll have, sorry, there was someone in the front who put up their hand straight away. Thank you.
Jimmy Grissom, member of Chatham House. Marco, you are the target today. Everyone's attacking you, but I'm not going to attack you.
He's a civilian.
Now, in international law, is international law selective in its application? That's A. B, in relation to issuing international arrest warrant for alleged war criminals, i.e. against Russian leader, why are we not doing the same thing against Netanyahu and his government? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Right.
Easy stuff.
Well, why not answer the one about intelligence? Spies are not combatants, because that is an interesting one, isn't it?
Hi, Mary Ellen. So I don't think we disagree. I put intelligence sharing in the hard case bracket. I just think there's two. I may have misspoke. We agree. So I think there's one type of intelligence sharing that is easy, and that is if you share intelligence about strategic intentions. So when the allies were telling the Ukrainians, they're going to attack you, they will attack you, right? As you remember, in the weeks leading up to February 2022, there was the constant messaging, Russia has made the decision to attack you. That type of intelligence sharing, which is about the strategic intentions of the other government, cannot lead to participation in a conflict. The really tricky, that's an easy case. The really tricky bit is immediate support to targeting. So when the CIA, remember the CIA article? So they say, you know, we are not pulling the trigger, but are we telling them what to do? I think that's a hard case. That's not an easy case. Yeah, that at least is my view.
Yeah. I'm not sure that we want to go all through the 31 or 32 NATO states deciding who's close to being a party or not. It depends on the facts, doesn't it? Isn't that the answer to that one? It really depends on the facts.
But if certain facts as alleged are true, so if the German chancellor is correct, for example, that British troops are operating Storm Shadow missiles in Ukraine, which I have no way of knowing, but that's what he said. And if that's true, like if there's a British guy actually pushing buttons to launch the missile, I think that's being party to the conflict.
It does seem to be fairly directly connected to hostilities. And one could... one could
your understatement. Yes, true.
All right. Yes, Francoise, welcome back again. Over there. Yes, I'm sorry, we'll come back to it. I beg your pardon.
I think international law, generally speaking, well, international law is exactly like domestic law in the sense that powerful people can get away with things that weaker people cannot get away with. That's true of any legal system in the history of mankind. Like no legal system treats powerful and rich people in reality as it treats poor and weak people. So if you think the British legal system treats a homeless person on the street in the same way as King Charles, you're mistaken, right? It does not. On your question, what is different about the ICC arrest warrants? Yesterday was the first arrest warrant against 2 Russian officers that dealt with conduct of hostilities issues. It took them 2 years. I think you really need to understand it is incredibly difficult to prove conduct of hostilities war crimes. It took them 2 years to ask for an arrest warrant for a conduct of hostilities case in Ukraine. The Putin arrest warrant was for a war crime he did on TV. On TV, he said, let's transfer the children from Ukraine to Russia. That's different from proving that, I don't know, that was not a military objective or that collateral damage was excessive. And if there will be war crimes warrants for Gaza, that'll take time. Is the honest answer, not me being, if you want to prove this so that the judge will actually issue an arrest warrant, you can't do that on the basis of TV reporting.
And I do apologize for getting that one. Francoise
Hampson, University of Essex. I'd like a reply from all the panel. I suspect that the one who'll be least reluctant is Marco, but this is not aimed at him. In February 2022, various states said, yes, we're going to do what we can to help, but there's all sorts of things we can't give you, that they are now giving them. Now, personally, I think in the first few months, the Americans, specifically the Americans, confused the law applicable and got it mixed up with neutrality. I also think that several states then and still continue to some extent to confuse the complicity issue with the issue of participation. But something has changed. We're now giving the Ukrainians things we didn't before, and before we said we couldn't. Is it that the understanding of the law has changed, or has something else changed, like political will?
Thank you, Francoise. I'm going to give that to Steve.
Thanks a lot, Francoise. It's great to see you. First of all, I agree with you that there has been some confusion, and it's perhaps understandable because this is complicated, between the different branches of law. Hopefully this event has helped tease out some of the differences between neutrality, complicity, co-partyship. I don't know if there's been a change in the understanding of the law. It was reported that there were various spirited legal discussions in a number of capitals about these issues, and presumably this process results in kind of greater specific understanding over time. And so I don't find it. I don't think you're saying that this is sort of a gotcha moment or somehow hypocritical. I don't think that's what your question is about. But I see it more as the result of very considered processes of legal advice, also consultation. both with Ukraine, but also with other allies, and maybe a sort of the result of sharing of views and information that's been going on, certainly, and perhaps a little tiny bit in public, but mostly behind the scenes. So I kind of see that as a natural evolution. Thank you.
If I may just come in on that, because I agree with you, Francoise, and I agree with Steve as well. I think there was at the beginning a number of leaders who were saying we can't supply this, and it seemed to be because they were concerned about what we now call co-party issues. And I think some who seemed very reluctant then seem most forward now. But I think the reason that it has changed is the reason Steve has given, which is this has led to a lot of consultation amongst allies with lawyers. And I think what has been remarkable, I think without being too indiscreet about consultations, there were consultations amongst NATO states, I think I can say that. And what is surprising is just how much there was agreement on the legal principles. In a way, sadly, in a way, conflict also generates advances in legal thinking. I mean, that's the way what this paper is about as well, and has clarified where people are. So I don't think it's a cynical, politically, we're more forward-leaning, therefore we've changed our view. I think what has happened is that people are now much clearer about where they are, and they are very cautious and very careful. I just going back to Marco's point again, I think we need to be very, very careful about not falling into some of the leaks, information, disinformation and so on, because it is escalatory in effect. And I think what is happening about leadership is they are being very responsible and very careful. So I see this as a positive trend rather than otherwise.
Thank you. That was helpful. Can we have the mic over here? Two questions, please.
Hi, John Curtis, House Commons Library. One of the issues you've got is when you have lack of information. So we've talked about a government, let's say the UK possibly has special forces in Ukraine, and maybe they are or not doing certain actions. I just wondered, is there necessarily, if you're a government advisor to them, a lawyer, a duty of candor there? Because technically it's a binary. If you have special forces in Ukraine who are, and I'm not saying they are, but in this scenario, were pulling triggers and involved in conflict, then you are a party to a conflict. But that has to be proved, right? You need Russia to give evidence, etc. So I suppose the question is to what sense, you have someone saying, well, if you do this, you are a party to conflict, but it won't be found out. So your worry is about being found out, not the actual being a party or not.
Thank you. Behind, thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for the amazing panel. Cordonian Yurie, originally from Moldova, not a lawyer, but working for a communication company, UPCO Worldwide. One of the phrases that I didn't hear tonight is proxy wars. Is there a legal standing for that? Because the war and the way the grand powers are making war is changing.
Thank you so much for that question, because I insisted to the author that we put in a little section on proxy wars, although he told me that there wasn't a legal concept. Anyway, it's gone into the paper, and it links in nicely with a question online, which is essentially, are we, the UK, this is William Gerard, are we in a state of war with Iran over our targeting of shipping in the Red Sea and the Iranian support of Houthi rebels in Yemen? So that's an example of what some people might say is a proxy war. Right. Who would like this one? Yemen, but not just Yemen, proxy wars. Yes,
on
Paul.
Yemen, I can say, look, when we are launching strikes in self-defense, we've been very clear about our legal position. We are in an armed conflict with the Houthis. That's clear. We're in an eye. I mean, it's probably the best analysis. But we're not with Iran.
Why not? Why isn't it a proxy war? Because Iran is, just spell it out.
You get into the extent to which a non-state actor is regarded as operating under the command and control and all the technical stuff of a state. And I don't think you can say that the Houthis in any way have that status. They are an independently kind of minded, managed, governed group. And they therefore may have support from Iran. I'm not an expert on the UD structure, but they are not, as it were, an arm of the state of Iran. So I mean, a proxy war is okay as a political concept. It may reflect a reality of support and the strategy of governments, but I don't think it helps as a legal concept.
Thank you. But as you said, if your armed group is under the command and control of a state, or another armed group for that matter, you could be said to be a party to a conflict with that one. Do you want to say anything about legal advisors to the government and how candid we are?
Lawyers are very candid in advising their ministers. That's certainly the case. And they get frank advice and they listen to the advice. And it goes back to what I was saying at the beginning. When you go in and see ministers and you say, if you do X, Y, Z, it will make you a party in armed conflict, they take that very seriously and they look at it through a political prism as well. There are recommendations in the paper at the end, and this was some discussion about, it says it's a very good thing if governments always say what their status is and they say what their status of their co-parties is as well. And I think the answer is, if we're very honest, it depends. Because, and I'm not talking about any situation now, and again, I'm slightly concerned that people seem to be speculating things purely hypothetically. There may be situations, states have covert forces, and there may be situations where covert forces are used. So I think it doesn't mean that those covert forces, when deployed, do not comply with the law of armed conflict, and it's strict. That's different from announcing to the world, hey, we're about to do this, and it's therefore an armed conflict. That would rather defeat the object of being a covert force. But that is nothing to do with the situations that we've mentioned today. I want to be clear about that.
Any other questions? Where's the mic? Oh, sorry. Yes, please. Sorry.
Ibrahim Aziz, lecturer at Salahuddin University. Thank you very much for all of you. My question and my comments for Marco about the co-party analysis. I am from Halabja. Halabja is a city in Kurdistan in Iraq. I will back to March 16, 1988. Saddam Hussein attacked this city by chemical weapon. I am a witness. I am a victim of that kind of day. In one day, 5,000 people had been murdered, thousands wounded. These chemical weapons, Saddam brought it or had been given by company from Western countries. This is kind of the co-party. Even in international law doesn't say this is the co-party from this kind of war. Actually, the war between Iraq and Iran, the Kurdish people inside Iraq, from the Iraqi citizenships that Saddam has done this kind of massacre. My question is, right now, the responsibility for others in the easy cases, if someone selling or brought in and given the chemical weapons and weapons to other party, I think if it's not international law say this is the co-party, in publics, people look at this kind of countries as enemy. At that time, Kurdish people, or at least the people in Halabja, say these weapons, when Saddam brought it, they say brought it from the company from the Western country. This is look at, kind of imagine how people look at, how people thought about the Western country, exactly the Western company. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. Another question, there was someone else just there.
Hi, Gal Cohen, PhD student at UCL. Thank you all for the very interesting discussion. My question relates to the name of the event and also something that Marco said. Marco, you referred to the subjective regime that we had before that, and if I understand correctly, it's the legal institution of war that was before armed conflict and use of force. So do you think there is any significance left to war in current public international law? And if not, why do you think the name of this event was chosen?
Oh, well done. Thank you so much for that question. We agonized about what to call this event, and the paper was going to be called Joining in Wars as well. Although as international lawyers, we all squirmed. But we thought it's a popular term.
It's sexy.
It's a popular term. And although we all knew it was inaccurate and we should have said joining in armed conflict, I'm afraid it was just that it's more catchy. So forgive us before we turn on to a detailed conversation of what war is. I know it was wrong to call this event Joining in Wars. Yes.
It does convey the flavour of what we're doing in terms of, this comes back to the political perception that we as lawyers label it armed conflict and think that's all fine and neat, but for everyone else this is war.
Okay, good. Well then we're fine. No apology needed. Thank you for that. Yes, we're going to... Now, are we on to complicity again when we talk about giving chemical weapons to another country?
That's what it is. So the example you gave is really not about participating in the armed conflict in this kind of direct sense. It's about being complicit in the crimes of another. That's what it is. And especially with something like a chemical weapon, when you give it to another party, you know they're going to use it for something bad. It's not like, you know, it can be used for a good purpose. So I think complicity is the right frame for the Halabja kind of scenario.
Do you know, I think it's time to stop because I think we all need a drink. Unless someone would be most unhappy if they didn't put a question. But if you are unhappy, please come up and have a drink and ask the relevant person. And I'm sorry we haven't picked up all the questions online. Thank you very much for the questions. They're of great help to me, I must say. But I'm sorry we haven't dealt with quite all of them. But please come upstairs if you can to join us for a drink. And please join me with thanking our speakers.